Oh, hi, I didn't see you there. My name is Bliss Foster. Welcome to the analysis of Rick Owens Fall Winter 2018 Sisyphus. This collection is so badass. I mean, look at that. Come on. No denying, you should be extremely excited. As always, we're going to go through the show together and we're going to read through the show notes so that we can all have a firm grasp on what it is that we're actually talking and looking at here. I'm sure that you've all looked at this and read these before, but we're just going to do a quick review. Here we go. Fall Winter 2018, ready to wear, Sisyphus. This women's fall-winter collection follows the men's fall-winter collection in being titled Sisyphus, after the arrogant king in Greek mythology who was punished by Zeus to repeatedly roll a boulder up a hill only to have it roll back down again, eternally. We might interpret this as a story about futility, or as a story of patterns monotonously repeating themselves without progression. For the men's show, I was focused on cycles of cultural backpedaling and disappointing social shifts. But for the women's show, the focus is on seduction. Clothes are communication, and the message is often one of seduction. But towards what results? In the past, there have been moments of almost grotesque physical distortion in the name of seduction. Paniers, bustles. It's been a while since this kind of deliberately sly exaggeration was embraced. Although the bulbous bags and backpacks in my recent collections can easily read refugee, I have principally deployed them as excuses to create credible volumes on the body. Padding here isn't necessarily about protection, but about voluptuousness and a crude sumptuousness. Tunics in camel hair and linen felt are packed with goose down to swaddle and envelop the body in uneven indentations and extensions to exaggerate the figure. Colors are muted and bleak. Coats, mantles, and mega parkas are worn over cashmere running shorts paired with generic-looking track shoes. Oversized work shirts, cargo chaps, and shoes are constructed in a synthetic shearling that trails loose filaments of recycled polyester yarn in an out-of-control haze, and some coats and t-shirts have been hand-painted in rough, thick resin brushstrokes. Coats are pieced and patched together in compositions ripping off Bauhaus Architecture with deep neutrino-lined patch pockets. The art povera seduction proposed here is a raw and indirect one. Some may call it anti-seduction, but what are the seduction rules and whose authority do I accept in defining them? The music accompanying this show is several versions of a 1950s show tune, Baubles, Bangles, and Beads, a song about dressing, seduction, and expectations. The wistful, yearning lyrics can strike a chord because we can all identify, while we also smile ruefully at its simplistic message in these complicated times. I have always defined camp as a cynic's excuse to embrace sentimentality. Holy wow, there's a lot to cover in that. Let's get started. Just so that we're all aware, you are currently watching the shorter version of this one. The full episode is much longer and it's only available through the Patreon. It's not that much. It starts at $3 a month, etc., etc. If you want to watch the full thing, you should go sign up. Let's start with the name. Sisyphus is a household name in Greek mythology. It's one of the only stories that maybe someone would recognize if they weren't already obsessed with ancient storytelling. This story is great though, by the way. So just to give you a quick overview of what it is we're actually talking about in this show, Sisyphus was the first king of Ephyra. He betrayed Zeus, and Zeus ordered Thanatos, who's the god of death, to chain Sisyphus down in the underworld. As they were walking down to the underworld so that Sisyphus could meet his fate, Sisyphus was like, "Whoa, Thanatos, those chains are sick, bro. Wow. I know that you got to do your job here, and I respect that, but could you just show me how those chains work real quick? They look so strong." And then Thanatos, like an idiot, said, "Haha, yeah, they are super strong. Wow, that's awesome. Most people are like, no, don't chain me up, but like, good on you for being curious, bro. I'd love to show you how they work." Then he put the chains on himself, and Sisyphus was like, "Now your dumbass is chained up and I am going to leave." So Zeus was obviously not happy, because not only had Sisyphus made a fool out of his god-king order, but he had also made it where the god of death was now chained up, so no one on earth could die. Which didn't last very long. I mean, it didn't take a lot of time for like all the gods to be like, "What's different here? Oh, no one is dying. Is Thanatos okay?" So then Sisyphus got punished by having to roll a boulder up a hill in the underworld, but the boulder was cursed, so whenever he would get it fairly close to the top, the boulder would sidestep him and roll back down the hill and make him start over. Eternally, that was happening forever. So it's very physically difficult, but it's also impossible, but there's always this like dwindling hope that it's like, oh man, I'm gonna get the boulder to the top of the hill this time, but then the hopes are always dashed because the boulder falls back down. I don't think it's any coincidence that the Sisyphus shows align with Rick's 20-year career retrospective, which was titled Subhuman, Inhuman, Superhuman. Not difficult for us to assume that the Sisyphus story aligns with fashion's endless, brutal cycle of constantly having to churn new things out. But at the same time, Rick is also one of those designers that spends a lot of his career trying to perfect a certain element in clothing. There's an interview where one time he said, "Some people have shoes from a few years ago and I don't like looking at them. Every so often I'll be at a party and get introduced to someone and think, you're wearing my greatest regret." And this thing of constantly being dissatisfied with the shape of a shoe or the way that a shoulder is executed is a fairly common thing among career fashion designers. And it's not so much a technique thing, it's more them trying to figure out how to perfectly express a certain emotion in the garments. And I imagine that that ongoing feeling of constantly looking back 3 or 4 seasons and saying, ugh, that looks awful. That feeling can kind of feel like you're constantly pushing a boulder up a hill just for it to fall back down the hill again. You're always approaching, but you're never reaching zero. But at the same time, we know from the Babel show analysis that we did a couple of years ago that Rick is kind of in love with this romantic idea of human beings not being able to perfect something, and so they just get up the next morning and they just go for it and try again. But the theme of Sisyphus also really applies to the whole idea of sexual seduction and lustful carnal desires in the first place. There's no shortage of sources that talk about that stuff as just kind of being a pit that can never be full, where you're constantly chasing after something that isn't ever going to really be achieved. And I think it's really interesting here that he points to the fact that a lot of his more recent work can be viewed as talking about refugees, when he makes it very clear that he's not trying to make that direct connection. At the time, this was in March of 2018, there were 30 million refugees worldwide. It was definitely a time of unprecedented refugee crises. I don't know if anyone remembers, but during the fall-winter 2018, that was a season where there were a lot more journalists and designers than usual who were just saying, dude, forget this. Like, this doesn't even feel important right now. So a lot of the designers that were doing kind of traditionally pretty things, brands that were sort of just focused on, you know, stereotypical feminine beauty, a lot of those brands were having to work through how they navigate there being a global refugee crisis and the Trump administration and all these other things that just seemed very bad and negative and, to be frank, more important in the world. And so Rick was able to sort of sidestep that a little bit by talking about sumptuousness, talking about seduction, but doing it in this way. It was one of those situations where he was able to talk about those more shallow topics because he was talking about those shallow topics in a way that challenged convention and conservatism. Moving right along. In the Comme des Garçons Spring-Summer 1997 Lumps and Bumps collection, to which every body morphing collection is inevitably compared, we can see an immediate comparison in that the lumps are down-filled as they are with Rick here. Stuffing the garments with down or having structural elements like peignets or bustles is really important because we're talking about seduction. These things all have just a gentle bounce to them, whether the wearer is walking in them or jumping as they are here. Further comparison to the Lumps and Bumps collection is in the book Fashion, A Fashion History of the 20th Century, wherein the author designates, quote, "Shown here are outfits with down pads sewn inside, creating irregular mounds on the surface of the clothes. The shape of the body is deformed by the clothes, and this shook up the standardized concept people have of their bodies. 20th century fashion discovered the body. However, the clothes seemed to conform to the shape of the body. Kawakubo tried to free the clothes from their enslavement to the body and discovered this new shape." End quote. I love this book. This book is freaking incredible. So throughout history, for the most part, women's bodies were being frantically covered up, but there was still an element of sultry seduction to it. I mean, like, you know, what is this supposed to be, right? Then about 100 years ago in the teens and the 20s and the 30s, fashion started to disengage from this idea of a structural element to women's dress and started getting things closer to the body. It became less of a game of trying to scaffold things up around the body and became more a game of how do we strategically reveal things and show skin in order to have this idea of seduction. And that's not really to say that anything politically improved by making that change. Women's bodies seem to just kind of always be be on trial for something. So to recap real quick, from 1910 for the next 100 years, the game of seduction was played through a revealing of different parts of the body, but it was mostly keeping to the actual literal body itself. Now in the 21st century, Rick is reverting back to the methods and the intentions of the past with this collection, but he is using his own codes. Hey, wake up, stay with me, no new tabs, let's stay right here. So he's using the methods and the intentions of the past, but he's using his own codes. The methods here are the artificial proportions, which this show has a lot of artificial proportions. I mean, like, what is this supposed to be? I don't think we actually defined these before. This is what a bustle is. And these are peignets. These are historic methods of augmenting the women's silhouette. So he's using the same methods, which is augmenting the women's silhouette, and he's using the same intentions, which is to seduce, but his codes are different. Instead of just going for a really trim waist and broad hips and cleavage, he's kind of trying out these different shapes because he's sort of asking the question, what is seduction and whose rules am I supposed to be following here for seduction? Exaggerating the body in different ways should be something that's up to the eye of the beholder. Anything should, in an ideal world, be equally seductive depending on your sensibilities. This is actually summed up pretty nicely in a recent interview where Rick said, quote, "I wanted to create something that mocked conventional aesthetic rules. Those can be extremely bigoted, narrow, and cruel. My idea is proposing alternatives not as another set of rules, but just as a proposal that if you can't be naturally beautiful, I propose my kind of beautiful. It can be modest, but it can be artificial. I'm a big believer in artifice. Artifice doesn't have to be vulgar and it doesn't have to be false. It can be a sense of formality. It can be gracious. It can be bringing something generous to the table." And that doesn't specifically relate to this show, but I do think that that quote kind of applies to what we're talking about here really well. And speaking of Comme des Garçons, there's another piece from Fall/Winter 1994 that was technically under the Comme des Garçons Noir label that definitely seems to relate to this collection. We don't have any specific like show notes or anything to tie that in a direct way, but it does seem like it might have inspired this as well, doesn't it? Another interesting factor is that Rick is truly combining the two different sensibilities of history. He's using the body augmentation, he's adding in these extra layers of things to give these like very bulbous features, but he's also revealing parts of the body, kind of the way that we switched to in the 19-teens, 20s, and 30s. So he's kind of combining both of those sensibilities in order to take us into the future. And that's a really interesting thing that you can see throughout a lot of Rick's collections, is that he seems to have this kind of periscope vision throughout history where he uses different elements of the past, different levels of sensibility that he's able to push us into what could be the future.
I think of timelessness a lot. I'm trying to paint as big a picture as possible. I'm trying to look at this huge spectrum instead of just the period that we're living in. How do I think of all of history, all of fashion history, and try and fuse it all together so that it makes something contemporary but also futuristic? That sounds tricky, doesn't it?
Also, it's interesting that he was using bags to create this volume, because in a lot of cases, that's what peignets were. They were just these very oversized pockets. You could like carry around so many sandwiches with these things. Next topic. The song that Rick used for this show is from a 1950s musical called Kismet. This was a stage play for a number of years, and then it became a major motion picture starring Howard Keel. You and I don't know him, but ask your grandma. She loves Howard Keel. That Howard Keel is so handsome. So anyway, the song is called Baubles, Bangles, and Beads, and it's just a song about women adorning themselves for purposes of seduction and husbanding. Rick even kind of makes a sly remark in the show notes, as we saw, about kind of the simplicity and silliness of this song. And Kismet as its own piece of art is very interesting. Like a lot of movies that inspire Rick, I don't know if it's useful for us to go through this movie and to find specific points of inspiration for specific outfits in the collection, because that doesn't really seem to be how Rick does things. But when you just look at screenshots from the movie, you can tell that this is something that, even if it didn't technically inspire Rick in a one-to-one kind of way, there's a lot of spiritual inspiration here. That if it's in the context of inspiring a Rick Owens show, you can kind of see an underlying theme of brooding darkness behind all of this stuff, even if that wasn't the intention of the original piece itself. himself. Okay, so let's look at the synthetic shearling that he talks about a little bit here. We can see these really clearly in the close-up detail shots from the runway. And I don't know if there's too much to talk about here from a symbolic perspective, but isn't this stuff just like so Rick? That is so Rick. At one point, Rick mentions that he rips off Bauhaus architecture. The whole Bauhaus movement of art is one of the most heavily trafficked reference points in all of fashion history, but I think the tie-in here is actually pretty straightforward. Okay, so here are some examples of Bauhaus architecture. You can see that there are some things here that look like they are just sort of tacked on, but are there for very specific purposes, like being stairs. So similarly, Rick has just kind of tacked on this stuff. And that's the story of how he ripped off Bauhaus architecture. Everyone knows that I love untangling things to the nth degree, but in this case, I really think it is just one of those things where he was like, oh, this looks very nice. I think I will do that to one of my outfits. Also, he mentions that some of the pieces are nutria-aligned. Nutrias are basically like otters. They're semi-aquatic rodents. I'm telling you, you are missing out if you are not watching these full episodes. I mean, you're really just getting like a little piece of what all we have to cover in these runway shows. If you want to watch the full episode, you just click the link that's appearing on your screen right now and join the Patreon. It takes a couple of minutes and there is a big old backlog of other content for you to watch on there. It's wonderful, beautiful stuff, and you'd be supporting independent journalism, which is always a plus because, to be frank, if y'all want this to stick around, you know, it's not gonna stick around on its own. Support the motherfucking Patreon. And if you can't support the Patreon, please at least don't hit skip on the ads so that I can make money from your viewership. You're so kind. I love you indefinitely. Goodbye.